in ourselves that will help us stand up to such enormous difficulties. So thank you for joining me. Again, this is the Nazarene Stream Preacher, and today we're going to be talking about wholehearted evil. And this is evil that ignores the truth. Rather than trying to defy goodness or truth, or even debate it or contrast it, we see a lot of things in our culture that just outright ignore the truth. They just outright do not care what is true, and it's like talking to a brick wall. But this is not how God designed us to be. So we are going to try to find some resolution in all this and hopefully have some good ways of navigating and moving forwards. Now, of course, I am playing the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, so that'll be going on. So hopefully we'll have some fun things as we get through this conversation. So all that being said, of course, let's jump right into our game. Again, wholehearted evil. In case you're kind of wondering what it is that I'm talking about, so often in life we have seen half-hearted evil, and we have come to be kind of comfortable with half-hearted evil. And I hate really to say that. We kind of got to be careful about talking about these things because we do not endorse or encourage such evils, but we've kind of come to expect the evil in the world around us to kind of be half-hearted, that it's something that is misunderstood, it has circumstantially been acting evil, it's not really wholehearted, interested in destruction and chaos. Well, we're at a point right now in time where really people are possessed by ideas and things, and there's a lot of wholehearted evil going on in our culture. And this is something which presents itself as if it is the truth without any acknowledgement of what actually is true. And for those who have eyes and ears for truth, which is a gift of God to have eyes and ears for truth, people who have those, they can obviously see what is true, and they obviously see that there are people ignoring truth, and this is such a frustrating thing. So what then do we do? Do we sit idle and wait for evil to corner us? You know, that's one of the great deceptions that has been told to people today, that you can't go out of your way to shine the light on evil. You can't go out of your way to speak truth. You can't go out of your way to stop evil. And that means exactly what you might think it means, to actually go out of your way to prevent these things from taking over in our society. We've been told that you can't really do that. You just need to wait around and kind of be like a cornered dog waiting for someone to beat you enough times that you bite back. And of course that only adds to more and more chaos. So what do? We have to start fighting for principles, just as the scriptures teach us. So it doesn't look like there's anything in this room, in this game Skyrim. You know, I haven't been here before, but all this stuff is empty, which is really, really crazy. But anyways, we'll move along. So the last few days and the last few programs I put up, I've talked about the scoliodoxy, and this is sort of the bent, crooked teachings which are used as the metric for good and evil. And now I've been preaching through the book of Revelation, and a lot of people, they look to Revelation chapter 13, they see this mark of the beast. It is a mysterious thing, and I think the best way to read the book of Revelation is exactly as what it says, that there is a cosmic battle between good and evil. Now, how these things fully come to fruition, I cannot answer for that, but we do have a lot of things that we have assurance in, and there's a lot of truth that we can learn. One of the things that's fascinating about the beast that you find there in Revelation 13, whether it be the first beast or the second beast, is that they really do have their own full religion. They have people who come and worship the first beast, and they're happy to worship the first beast, and this beast, it ignores truth. And we have a lot of things in our modern day and age that ignore truth. You can look at how the news media really operates in our modern day and age and see that there are so many times where people ignore truth. Just this week, there was a news anchor or host, I'm not sure exactly what his position is at CNN, Brian Stelter, who was on C-SPAN, and he had a caller come in and brought up all the times that CNN had spread deceptive information. They had twisted and contorted stories to the point where they weren't really reflecting the truth. And this guy said, you know, y'all want to call out people for lying, but I sat down and I put together some math and saw that y'all had lied. It was something crazy, like 300,000 times was their quantity of lies over whatever period of time that this man had calculated this. And when it comes time for Brian Stelter to respond to this, he says, you know, I thank you for your call. There are people in our nation who have called us the enemy of the people, and that's a real problem. And that was basically his response to it. He never acknowledged that they had willfully lied. And the man who called in, he brought up the Covington Kathleen situation where the teenager had been slandered by CNN, and they had to pay out a lot to this kid. They settled it outside of court, so It's verifiable that they have been lying, but the guy wouldn't even acknowledge it. And which is sad, because I don't want him to exist like that, and I don't want to just sit over here and live in a world where we own those who ignore truth, and kind of have the perpetual chaotic debate where it's all my sensation versus your sensation. If we want to be a people who move towards truth, we have to have something better than that, because you cannot have a society where people just blatantly ignore truth like this. And C.S. Lewis writes about this in his book, The Perelandra, which is effectively it's a fictional novel. It's kind of a fantasy version of the Garden of Eden, but it doesn't take place on Earth. It's a new creation that God has. It's something. They're above us. And instead of there being three characters in the garden, being the serpent, and of course God is there too, but God is a transcendental figure. But instead of there being the serpent, Adam and Eve, there's the serpent, Adam and Eve, and then another man who God has sent to stop this fall from happening. Now the main character, when he meets the serpent character, he says, up to this point I'd never seen anything but half-hearted evil. But this creature was wholehearted. It did not bother with defying truth or goodness, but it ignored it to the point of annihilation. And that really is something which goes on in our world. We see people who ignore truth. And you see this in news interviews all the time. I mean, obviously it happens in politics. It happens with celebrities too, when they get caught in scandals and things. People, they just act. I mean, it'd be like if I walked over to you and you had on a purple shirt, and I said, "Hey, why are you wearing a purple shirt today? Is that from like your college or something like that?" And someone would look at you and say, "Green is my favorite color. I only ever wear green. Green is so wonderful." And spend like 5 minutes filibustering over how much they love green and never even acknowledge what you said about the purple shirt. That's where we're at in society. And this is not how God designed us to be. And I've got this freeze time stuff here. Oh man, this dude's bad. This dude is very bad. So what we have to realize is that ignoring truth is a tactic of deception. This is one of the scoliodox doctrines of demons. The scoliodoxy, this sort of fake orthodoxy that goes on in the world. And you can contrast scoliodoxy with orthodoxy. They're not quite opposite sides of the coin, because the scoliodoxy, it's bent. You can choose when it changes. And we see this happen in our time. It's sort of this fake set of virtues and values that people are told to go along with. And it's very, very tragic, because a lot of people have been sold on this stuff. But there's great power in deception. And ignoring truth is a power of deception. It is a very deceptive thing to do. But we in the church, we're called to do something better than that, because we have to love our enemies, love our neighbors. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Satan sits on the throne. To consider the kingdom of God as one of service and one that's upside down and contrary to the powers of the world. That doesn't mean that Satan is on the throne or that you serve evil motives. You've got to slip over here and health up. But one of the things which is so tragic is there really are two ways that I see this ignorance of truth. And I'm using the word ignorance as in willfully ignoring the truth. There are two ways that I really see this happening in our society. There are people who thought they were open-minded, and the God-shaped hole existed in their life. And look, the God-shaped hole is real, and the devil is very happy to fill that hole. And they had the God-shaped hole in their life. Evil came and filled it, and instead of them having biblical traditions and things guiding them, and again, this doesn't mean that everyone was perfect Christians, though we're certainly called to be perfected by Christ. But there were people who may have some connection to biblical orthodoxy. They may not understand that, but they had some connection to it. That's where a lot of people in America were. But then there was this new group of people which came on the scene which did not have that. They had a hole in their life. It started a few decades ago, where they started deliberately taking God out of the public sphere and saying, "Oh, we'll wait till children become adults and they can choose." And that left a hole in their life, and the scoliodoxy replaced it. Instead of people having some connection to biblical traditions, They now had a entirely different set of virtues and things in their life that were all fake virtues and bent towards chaos. Well, what is terrible is that it wants to infect the church. And it really, really, really wants to infect the church. And so you have these two sides of the deception. There's the ones where people, they're outside the church and they are deceived. They were just somewhere wandering around aimlessly, and this came and sat in their heart. But then there were people who were walking in the truth of Christ. And the spirit of this age, the scoliodoxy, the forces of darkness, they came to people and wanted them to embrace these truths, which were not actually true, sort of half-truths. So there was sort of an internal, within the church, amount of chaos and then an external amount of swell. But regardless, you can't hold a society together when this is going on. You just can't. And it is very, very bad. Though, we have to look at our world around us and realize the reason why you can't hold a society together is because you can't advance the cause of good when this is the case. And one of the big problems of people inside the church and people really being manipulated and deceived in this way is they're not going to be crusaders for truth. They kind of deny that it's a problem. Like, for so long, people have denied the fact that, well, we're in a culture war, that there is a battle of belief systems. For a long time, people, even within the church, have denied the fact that there is a problem within theology that's not fundamentalism. That progressivism itself within the theology could be highly destructive. And they kind of make people choose between the two poles as if they're both sides of the street. Which is not the case. It's not the case at all. There's a lot of ways that things can go awry within the church. And we're not at a time where fundamentalism is the way that is happening. Unless you consider fundamentalism of the scholadoxia, I think. Which does function very much like fundamentalism, but instead of being tied to the larger truths or what is perceived to be larger truths, it's just whatever is popular in the culture, whatever popular sentiment is at the time. And whenever people deny the reality that we're in the middle of a culture war, that we are in the middle of... And I've got to change my clothes a little bit. Whenever people deny all of this stuff, they're not going to be crusaders. They're not going to be able to stand against it. And that has pushed me as a Nazarene, someone who firmly affirms the articles of faith. When I look to our doctrines on entire sanctification, I have kind of added an addendum to the doctrine of entire sanctification in my teaching, and it's not something which is contradictory to it, but a specific detail that when one is perfected by Christ, when one experiences a work of grace that comes in and brings that transformation, it should not just change your temperament and your relationship to sin, but it should change the way that you see the world. And it really, really should change the way that you see the world. It shouldn't just be something which makes you have hushed tones and be calm, because even as we know, there are times when Jesus, he gets frustrated and he turns over temples. It's not just a live without time, you never get frustrated with things and you have a calm temperament. The devil can do that. But how you see the world, you shouldn't be being deceived by the darkness if you are truly sanctified and transformed by God. And I've got to drop some of this stuff. Oh man, that's worth a lot. That's worth a lot. That is not. Oh. And I've got to change my stuff around here to figure out what the button is to drop it. It's Y. Okay. Trash, trash. Let's see what else is trash. Oh, yeah, the big trash. Big trash. Big trash. Okay. Oh, we're good now. So, getting back to our conversation of how do we deal with this, right? Well, you can't advance the cause of goodness unless you're acknowledging that the battle is at hand. And so we've got to acknowledge the battle is at hand. It has come to us and we have to deal with it. Well, there is a commentator named Steve Dace who describes in politics there are three categories of people, and I'm going to borrow, not stealing it, I'm giving an attribute to him. There's a concept of crusaders, gangsters, and groupies. And this really happens in all institutions. It's not just found in politics, but there are people who are crusaders, there are gangsters, and there are groupies. And what this means is there are some people who aren't really in it for the money. They're not in it for the power. They're in here crusading for the cause. And if they're a martyr for that, that's fine. And you see this in politics. There are people who would be happy to even to lose everything if they can advance a certain cause. And they really fit in the category of crusaders. Now, this is the rarest of the three categories, and it is the most powerful one. It's not rock, paper, scissors where, a groupie can beat a crusader or a gangster can beat a crusader. No, the crusader will trump all the others. You look throughout history, the people who win wars are the ones who have the most conviction in their cause, generally, unless you've got something like overwhelmingly against that. But when you see how history is turned in the long run, it is always the people who have the strongest conviction in their cause that win in the long term. And you see this is how Rome failed. They lost conviction in their own cause of who they were. And we, as the people of God, we have to have strong conviction. We can't hold this stuff accountable with laws and technicality, which brings us to our second group, the gangsters. Gangsters, they're not here to advance a cause. They're here to satisfy their desire for whether it be power, status quo, money. They're just here to kind of keep the system working because it benefits them in some way. And they like the status quo. So, they'll do business with whoever, and you find this in institutions. You find it within the church. How, one leader does one thing, and then the next leader comes in and says, well, that was bad, we're doing something totally different. But all the people around that leader is like, yeah, well, everything's all well and good. They never kind of admit that what they were doing in the past was bad, because, again, there's this gangster mentality that says, I'm here to protect the status quo. It's always well and good. There's nothing ever really bad going on. And most of the people who are on the side of truth right now that we have as leaders, they're either gangsters or groupies. And groupies is the least powerful of these. These are people who are just happy to be there. They want to have a seat at the table, even though they lack any real... Great. I was not prepared for the battle that was in this room. Groupies, they're just happy to be there. They want to get some attention. They want people to like them. They're happy to be a part of things, but they're not really moving or doing anything terribly influential. You look throughout the world, you can see in just about every institution you imagine, people are either crusaders, groupies, or gangsters. In Nehemiah chapter 6, we get an example of a false prophet. And Nehemiah is a crusader, y'all. He is a man willing to be a man when no one else is. And he is a crusader for God's holiness, for God's excellence, for God's achievement, and even for God's liberty. And we need more people willing to be a crusader in that. He doesn't come along and tell the people of Jerusalem like, oh, technically this or that. He doesn't make these technical arguments that says, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. He comes along and says, it is shameful to live in ruins, so we're not going to do that. We're going to be excellent and holy because our God is excellent and holy. But in Nehemiah chapter 6, and I'll just read this for a second, so swapping screens here for you. Nehemiah comes in, and we find some false prophets who are trying to destroy and stop Nehemiah's revival. And I want us to see how these false prophets, they ignore truth, and how Nehemiah responds to it, because that will help us respond to people who ignore truth in our modern day and age. And it will help us learn to be crusaders, to stand up to this stuff, to stand up to deception, to stand up to false messages, to fake virtues, the scoliodoxy, I should say. So Nehemiah 6:10 reads as follows. One day I went into the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, son of Mehetabel, who was confined to his house, and he said, oh, come, let us meet together. Let us come within the house of God, within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. Indeed, they are coming this very night to kill you. And then I, this is Nehemiah, looked at them and said, should a man such as I run away? Would a man like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. And then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, that he had pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Okay, so what you got in that story is in the book of Nehemiah, it has all the details filled in very well. What you find in that story is a false prophet. And this is what false prophecy looks like. It ignores truth, but it sounds so deceptively true. This is wholehearted evil at work, y'all. You read through these verses here, and Shemaiah, the false prophet, he comes to Nehemiah and he says, "Let us meet together in the house of God." Well, generally, when one is having a problem, it is good to turn to God. But this is something meant to actually turn you away from God, because you're not motivated to serve God, you're motivated to serve a lie. And that's a very important distinction to make. Whenever people, we don't worship God because someone else tells us to. We don't worship God, and we don't serve God by the standards and will of other people. We're not motivated to serve the narratives of the world. That is what Shemaiah is trying to get Nehemiah to do. But it sounds something like truth, because, it is good to turn to God. Well, in the second statement he gets there, he says, "There are those coming to kill you. Indeed, they are coming this very night to kill you." That also, there are people in this world that are trying to kill Nehemiah, Sanballat and Tobiah, namely. And also Geshem, the Arab, who evidently is infallible. No, that's a bit of a joke. You read this whole chapter and they say, "Oh, Geshem says that you have done this and that, and since Geshem says that it's true, well, whatever." There are people that want to kill Nehemiah. So, if you look at the world, Nehemiah looks at this false prophecy, it sounds very true, right? Well, the whole thing's a lie. You can look at every phrase in there and justify each phrase, but it ignores the truth of creation that says we serve God. It ignores the truth of the matter. And in fact, if Nehemiah went along with this statement, this prophecy, which sounded so true, what he would find is that he himself would be separated from God. He would have sinned against his God. And also the people that would have tried to destroy him, they would have destroyed him, because this is a trap, but they would have also ruined the momentum of his revival. It would be one thing if they just kill Nehemiah and make him a martyr, but if they can kill him in a way that is him sinning, then they ruin the momentum of his revival. So it's very evil. This is what real false prophecy looks like. And I hope I haven't been too close to this microphone getting hot. If so, y'all forgive me. Not the best at doing all this, but the Lord be with us as we do some critical thinking. So Nehemiah, he says no to this. He doesn't debate with it. He doesn't negotiate with it. And again, we don't have to listen to every voice in the world. And especially if people think that listening means obeying and making concessions, because we don't compromise with evil. God never tells us to compromise to evil. We listen to his will first. Being in a kingdom that is fundamentally different from the world doesn't mean we just acknowledge that the devil sits on the throne or something ludicrous like that. But that's what a lot of people mean when they say listen, that we need to listen to one another. They don't mean that we need to move towards truth. They mean you should step away from the truth and come compromise something with me, which is very bad, very bad. So we have to be crusaders for truth and for principles. And another thing that Nehemiah does in his book that is very powerful is that when he puts other people in charge of things, because he goes from being a cupbearer to a governor, is that he doesn't put people in charge of things that are groupies or gangsters. He puts people in charge who are crusaders. And again, this book has a lot of details filled in. And in Nehemiah chapter 7, and I don't know that I can quote scripture while doing this. Nope, I can't. Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 2, he says, "And then I gave to my brother Hanani charge over Jerusalem, and then I also gave Hananiah the commander of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many." Nehemiah puts Hananiah in charge of what's the palace, the citadel there. He puts him in charge of that because he's a man that fears God. We find a lot of people saying things. We find false prophets. We find all these speeches given by people. Nowhere in the book of Nehemiah does Hananiah go out begging, asking to be put in charge of something. But because he is willing to fear God, that's why he's put in charge. And we do well to appreciate this. We do well to put people in charge of things that are crusaders and not just gangsters. I've seen a lot of things in my life where people aren't held accountable for the right reasons. They're held accountable to technicalities, which are less important than principles, which is so sad. And just as we wrap up this conversation, one of the other things that we have to do is we have to make distinctions between the primary expression of something and the medium that it manifests on. So, to give an example of what I mean by that, this video game, there's a cartridge in a Nintendo Switch. Beyond that, there's a lot of code, but we're not sitting here watching ones and zeros, are we? We're watching the story of this Catman, the Dragonborn, fight Otar the Mad. The medium that this takes place on is a lot of signals and electronic components communicating with one another, but we're not here to be entertained by that. We're here to hear the story of how the Dragonborn fights Otar the Mad and, the various dragons here in Skyrim. The primary expression is what the actual story is. What is really going on here? Why do we care about this video game? And the medium is it's a Nintendo Switch version. I've got these controllers and things. That's the medium. A lot of times people conflate these two. And that's one of the ways that they get you deceived. They get you to pay attention to one thing and not the other. This is particularly true when it comes to being a crusader versus a gangster. Gangsters like to play with the mediums to get things changed. Groupies will kind of do whatever. But crusaders, they focus in on what really matters the most. We have to make distinctions in life. Well, what is the real principle here? And an example of that is what I was talking to about listening. Is listening the real principle, or is moving towards truth the real principle? Is debate itself the real principle, or is it the pursuit of truth and goodness and all things that are noble? Like, what is the real principle? And we have to be willing to look towards what matters most and not just get hung up on technicalities and lesser things. So kind of in summation of our conversation today, and y'all bear with me as I look to get a little bit better at this, is that we have to be crusaders when we're up against wholehearted evil. Things that ignore truth. You're not going to be able to debate with them. They've been sold on a different belief system. And if we want people to step away from that belief system and into the light, we're going to have to look for moments where people are hungry in their soul, where they're kind of like the centurion we talked about yesterday. They witness something, whether it be a crisis, a spectacle, whatever it may be. They witness something which moves them, and they are willing to see the world a little differently. There's kind of a critical moment. We have to be willing to go out of our way to stop evil, and we ourselves, we need to make sure our leaders are being crusaders and not just gangsters or groupies, and we ourselves don't need to be gangsters or groupies. We always need to be looking towards something which is far, far nobler. And look at this, we've got a word of power. So what a great place to end. So thank you for joining me. I hope that this conversation has been meaningful, and may God be with you in all that goes on here on this earth. May you look for truth and not find your comfort and joy in the surroundings we have on this earth, but instead find your comfort and joy in the great truths of God. And as John writes to us, there is great joy for my children to walk in the light. There is great joy when we walk in the light. So thank you for spending time with me. Again, I'm Pastor J. Dylan Proctor here at the Nazarene Stream Preacher, I should say. It's of course play on the word Screen Preacher, but whatever. God love you.